Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Ghost of the Revelator by L. E. Modesitt Jr., narrated by Tim Campbell. 1. The late October New Bruges drizzle, more liquid ice than rain on that Friday night, clicked off the Stanley's thermal finish all the way down from the house into Vonderbrack Center. Beside me, Lisette sat, drawn into herself, as she always was before she performed. When you're a professor and retired spy married to a former diva of old France who's been the toast of a Europe now crumbled under Ferdinand's boots, you always hope for peace and quiet, especially when you finally turn the disaster of two ghosts in your life into a mere inconvenience. And sometimes you get it. But this time even the ice was only the calm before a bigger storm. The ice rains. At times, Johan, would that we lived where I did not need 2 coats and wool garments. I know. I'd learned early to say nothing controversial before she sang. I was just thinking that over midterms we might take a vacation in Saint-Martin. There's a weekly dirigible from Aston. I will not endure that long a time. Lisette shivered. And tonight they will applaud like cows. For what do I sing? Because you're a singer. Singers sing. You sing magnificently. Once I did. Now, I do not know. You'll be magnificent. I know it. I eased the steamer to a stop right opposite the side door to the old physical training building, set the brake, and scurried around with a black umbrella to escort Lisette up and inside. I kissed her on the cheek, again. You'll be fine. Fine is for gold, Johan. You'll sing magnificently. We shall see. She headed up the half-flight of steps to the practice room where her accompanist, Johanna, waited. She'd already warmed up at the house on the Harden console grand piano. I'd purchased that for her with part of my bonus for resolving the governmental ghost crisis. Given what I'd put Lisette through, she deserved the piano, and more. Given what Archduke Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and my own beloved country of Colombia had put her through, even a concert Steinbach wouldn't have been the first installment on true repayment to her, but I was trying. I went back to move the Stanley into a more legitimate spot in the car park, getting even wetter in the process because it was about 4 times as far from where I parked to the front of the music and theater building. Good evening, Dr. Eschbach. One of Lisette's students was handing out programs, but I didn't recall her name. Amelia von something or other. Then most of the students at Vonderbrack State University were from New Bruges. Most had a predominantly Dutch heritage, and that Dutch reserve that made Lisette's teaching and exercise as much in trying to bring emotion to singing as to develop the basics of music. Good evening. To my surprise, the foyer was relatively crowded, and I turned toward the theater itself, but didn't get that far. Dr. Eschbach, Dr. Eschbach. Katrinka Erechus had the kind of voice that penetrated, but I suppose that kind of penetration was sometimes useful for the dean of the university. Her bright and overly broad smile was dwarfed by the expansive white lace collar that topped her too ample figure. Although the auburn hair was faultless, I suspected the original shade had been mousy brown, but there was nothing mousy about her. Rat-like, perhaps, but not mousy. Dean Erechus. I bowed to her, and then to Alois, her even more rotund husband, a retired major in the New Bruges Guard, as was obvious from the squared-off nature of his white goatee, the guard pin in his lapel, and the dark grey cravat and suit. He returned the bow without speaking. I had heard that your presentation on environmental politics and policies was masterful, the dean continued. Dr. Doniger was most complimentary. I'm glad David was pleased. Dr. David Doniger, my chairman and head of the newly reformed Department of Political and Natural Resource Sciences, was usually a pain in the posterior. Johann. Her voice lowered, but not the overpowering quantity of that floral fragrance that some vain and aging women immerse themselves in under the delusion that olfactory stupefaction will result in visual illusion. The von Emstens were so pleased that you are the first professor to occupy their endowed chair. Peter was particularly supportive of your past achievements and your dedication to Colombia. He served in the Singapore incident in the Republic Air Corps as you did. I am so glad that all such unpleasantnesses are behind us now. The bright smile indicated that any such unpleasantness had best remain behind us all. The Singapore mess, when Chung Kuo had devastated the city, had been well before my time, and Peter von Emsten and I had merely passed pleasantries at the ceremony where I had been installed as the first von Bain Professor of Applied Politics and Ecology. I doubted most knew the ironies involved with my selection to establish the formal legacy of Elysia von Emsten's father's forebear, and I wasn't about to explain. After all, how could I? A spy carrying on the legacy of another spy. I am delighted that they were pleased. Alois merely nodded, as he did frequently when with the dean. When I finally entered the theater that had been the sole lecture hall of the old physical training center, I checked the program. At least Lisette no longer had to resort to under-the-table handouts from the Austro-Hungarian Cultural Foundation to make ends meet. Tucked in among the recital pieces, besides An die Nacht and Barbara's monastic songs, was Anne Boleyn's aria from Heinrich Verrückt. Lisette had wanted to do that aria at her recital the fall before, but had done the Mozart anti-mass instead. She'd needed the stipend from the Cultural Foundation. The recital had been the night Miranda Miller, the piano professor, had been murdered, and that had started Lisette's and my adventures with several different covert operations, including those of my former employer, the Sedition Prevention and Security Service, more widely and less popularly known as the Spazi. I shivered a touch. The last thing Lisette and I needed was anything more along those lines. The house was almost full, with nearly all of the 450 seats filled nearly a half hour before Lisette was due to sing. I paused for a moment before I sat down, about halfway back on the aisle, still surveying the audience. In about the 10th row, in the middle, sat a bearded man in dark clothes. Not the dark clothes of the Dutch, or even of a conservative Southerner, but different, somehow, almost out of the last century. Not too far from the stranger sat Dirk Jeffries, Lisette's chair. On the far side I even saw Marie Rhine, who cleaned the house for us, along with an older man I guessed had to be her husband. After I seated myself on one of the all-too inflexible Dutch colonial hardwood seats, I glanced back at the bearded man. The seats on either side of him had remained empty, even as the house filled. The lights dimmed. Lisette stepped on stage, dark hair upswept, almost imperial in the shimmering green gown, and I forgot about the bearded man. Johanna's fingers caressed the keys of the Concertsteinbach, and the sound shimmered into the evening. Then Lisette began, a selection from Perkins, not one from a Fondel opera. Lisette sang beautifully. She always had, but now there was something else, even more of a spark or a lambent flame. She had the entire audience, even the stolid Dutch burghers, standing and yelling after she finished the encore, something from an opera I'd never heard, Susanna, and she smiled back at them. The other thing I'd never heard in Van der Broek Center was so much applause from the normally restrained Dutch. Lisette's department chair, that was Dirk Jeffries, caught me in the aisle. I didn't think she could get better, she was so good. He shook his mane of gray-blonde hair. I've heard some of the best, Delegati, Ricciarelli, Rizanek. Tonight she was better than any of them. I'd never heard better, but I was no expert. From the hypercritical Dirk, that was high praise. Best you tell her. If I did, she'd just dismiss it as the pride of a smitten spouse. I will, Dirk laughed, and I let him head down the aisle first, listening as I did. Better than korfball any day. Good, but don't know about that, murmured the tall blonde youth who probably was on the university korfball team, which had lost badly to Rensselaer the night before. The bearded man in the old-fashioned suit, except it seemed new, had a broad smile on his face as he bowed to Lisette backstage and murmured something before stepping away and vanishing. I followed Dirk and a square-faced Hans Weitjen backstage. Weitjen was the chief of the watch for Van der Broek Center, and he'd avoided speaking to me ever since my actions had led to 3 of his officers being turned into zombies because one had been suborned by an Austrian covert agent. Dirk stepped aside, and the watch chief bowed to Lisette. You were magnificent. Then he turned to me. Almost magnificent enough to forgive you for marrying Dr. Eschbach. Weitjen nodded and was gone. At least a year after the unfortunate incident he was speaking to me, and he hadn't protested, so far as I knew, when the Citizenship Bureau, after years of dithering, had finally granted Lisette her citizen status, and I'd never known he liked singing. Dirk shook his head again. Unbelievable! No wonder you were the toast of the Académie Royale. I was truly blessed tonight. After another incredulous handshake, he, too, slipped away. You were wonderful. I hugged her, and I even had remembered chocolates and flowers, but they were waiting for her at home. You've never been better. Lisette smiled, shyly for a moment. Better we were, and better yet we will be. You, not we. We, she corrected me. And it is good, Johan. Sad, but good. I swallowed and hugged her, knowing my own cheeks were suddenly damp. Fräulein Dubois? With others still arriving to see Lisette, I stepped back to her shoulder, nodding at Johanna and murmuring, You played well. She sang, Johan. The accompanist shook her head slowly. Singing like that you seldom hear. Seldom. I've never heard it before. I can see that I have missed too much. Katrinka Erechus, Alois, stolidly behind her, smiled her broad and false smile. You were delightful, dear, absolutely delightful. Her eyes went to me. You have been too modest about her, far too modest, Johan. As if it were my fault that the former chair of the music and theater department hadn't bothered to come to Lisette's recitals before. I forced a smile. She has always been magnificent. Oh, I can tell now, but how was I to know? I could have asked myself the same. Once I'd thought about enhancing her singing with my ghost projection equipment to create supporting angels, but after what I'd heard, that would have been too great a sin, far too great. Then maybe any use of the equipment to influence people would have been, and I just hadn't understood then. Enchanting, offered Alois, stolidly easing the dean aside for once. Wonderfully enchanting. Alois bowed and escorted the dean back toward the foyer. Professor Dubois, asked a red-haired student, tears streaming down her face, how can I ever do the Perkins the way you do? Lisette waited. Couldn't we change places? I'll never be able to sing like you do. You wish to sing better? Then work you must. I will hear the Perkins on Tuesday. Lisette softened the words with a smile and a pat on the girl's shoulder. Your coat? I prompted, as the admirers began to thin. It is in the practice room. Do you need a ride? I asked Johanna as I started to retrieve the heavy coat. Peter is already getting the steamer. The accompanist smiled briefly at Lisette. Even he was touched, but he won't admit it. That is quelque chose incredible. After ensuring that Lisette was wrapped in the coat, I managed to ease the 3 boxes of chocolates and several sprays of flowers under my free arm, and to escort her to the side door. You wait here, and I'll bring the Stanley around. That is fine with me. She shivered, as she often did after heavy exertion, and wrapped the heavy coat around her. The Stanley started easily, despite the streaks of ice and cold water, and the rain had turned to tiny frozen pellets. Lisette almost slipped getting into the steamer. Before long, the road and car park would be black ice. The town square was mostly deserted except for the lights in the watch station, and I wondered if Chief Etienne had stopped by on his way home. That is, if he had one besides the station. Who was the bearded fellow? I asked. I've never seen him before. The bearded? Oh, the man with the ancient cravat. Lisette shrugged under the heavy wool coat. Never have I seen him. He offered me his name. James Jacob Jensen? He said we would be hearing from him. Then he was gone. That's all? He said my singing it was as grand as any. It was. I laughed. But I wondered about Herr Jensen. When unknown admirers promise that you'll hear from them, you have to wonder in what context. The River Vike was dark, even under the new lights from the bridge. On the other side, I had to go into four-wheel drive once we started up Deacon's Lane, because the narrow uphill road had a thin layer of ice and slush. I had the feeling we were in for an early and hard winter, unlike the previous year. I dropped Lisette by the door while I maneuvered the steamer into the car barn. She glanced up the stairs as we stepped into the front foyer. Force of habit, still, I suspected, from the days when Carolyn, the family ghost, had lurked there. That had been before my efforts with ghosting technology had ended up grafting her into both our souls. It hadn't been planned that way, and it had saved us from worse, but it wasn't always easy living with feelings and memories you knew weren't yours. I felt it was even harder for Lisette, and for that reason didn't mention Carolyn much.
Good it is for there to be no ghosts looking down the stairs. I would dread looking up there.
I know. I always looked first. I locked the door and took off my topcoat, then led her back to the sitting room. You just sit here in front of the stove. Although I'd loaded the wood stove before we'd left and the sitting room off the terrace was warm, I opened the stove door and added another 2 lengths of oak. The heat welled out and Lisette leaned forward to get warm. I'll get your wine. Or would you like chocolate? As I turned, I could see the piano in the rear parlor. I'd never really used that space before, but it had turned out to be the best place for the piano, and the room was warm.
The wine. I am warmer already.
She looked up at me, her green eyes wide.
You are good to me. To us.
After everything, you say that. I swallowed. It was still hard. I love you. A smile crinkled her lips.
Dutch you are. For all your words, mon ami, some you find difficult.
She was right. I did.
The wine?
Her voice was softer now when she spoke, softer than when we had first met, but neither of us needed to discuss that. I ducked downstairs. There was a relatively new case of Bahan Red, a mountain Sebastopol. Probably not so good as a really good French wine, but better than anything else, and the French hadn't been producing good wines for the last 15 years or so, not since Ferdinand had reduced the French population by more than 30% in his infamous march. Once I'd opened the bottle, I brought her a glass, with my chocolates. They were the 4th box, but how would I have known? Here is the wine, and my small offering. I didn't tell her about the roses up in the bedroom. She'd see those later.
Good,
she smiled, and her eyes smiled with her mouth.
French it is not,
but almost as good, I finished. Lisette would never admit that Colombian wine would match that of her vanquished homeland, but we could laugh about it. About the wine, not about her terrors, nor the torture under Ferdinand, nor the hard years after.
Almost.
I sat down beside her on the new sofa. We'd redecorated a great deal in the 6 months since we'd been married, with my own glass of Sebastopol. Outside, the ice pellets turned into snow, and the wind gusted. I eased back to enjoy warmth of the stove, of the Sebastopol, of the coming weekend, and mostly of Lisette. 2. The ice and snow that had intermittently fallen over the weekend and into Monday had long since vanished under Tuesday's sun. Only a light frost remained on the browned grasses of my neighbor Benjamin's fields as I drove the Stanley across the grey waters of the River Vike and into Funderburg Center just before 9 on Wednesday morning. Lisette and I were cutting it close, since she had a student at 9 o'clock for applied voice.
Mercredi, c'est le jour du diable.
Lisette had come to speak a bit more French in the months since we'd been married, and I wondered how much strain always speaking English had been. The midweek peak, I agreed.
I talk and they listen, and still I must beat the notes. Nod they do, but understand they do not.
The ever-present Constable Gerhardt waved and smiled above his sweeping moustaches as we slowed on our way around the square that held the Watch Building, the Dutch Reformed Church, the Post Center, and McCardle's, the sole full grocery emporium in the area. Then we were past the good constable and heading uphill toward the Music and Theater Building. "Lunch at Delft's right afternoon?" I asked.
Mais oui, mon cher.
At least I got a dazzling smile before the more somber look clouded her face, as she turned toward the Music and Theater Building and her hapless and probably clueless young Dutch student. Dutch students were no different from any other students in thinking that mere mental effort should effect physical results. It doesn't work that way in singing, or in anything, but that's a lesson that almost never can be passed from generation to generation, but must be learned the hard way. As Lisette kept saying, "The head it is smart, but the muscles are dumb." But all too many students didn't want to put in the mental and physical effort required to train dumb muscles. Before I headed to my own office, I stopped outside Samaha's to pick up the Aston Post Courier. While Samaha's Factorium and Emporium had been on the corner opposite the bridge for well over a century, so had far too much of the inventory. The proprietor, one Louis Samaha, not only refused to answer to anything except Louis, but he was also the only shopkeeper left in town who had individual narrow paper boxes for his special customers. I continued to have a fondness for some traditions, even as I had watched them unravel all around me. The decor of Samahas consisted of dark wooden counters and rough-paneled walls that contained fine cracks older than any current living beings in Funderbrack Center, perhaps even older than some of the ghosts. The modern glow panels in the ceiling had so far failed to shed light on the store's history or the inventory in the deeper counter shelves. I ignored the bakery counter and the breads and rolls heavy enough to sink a dreadnought or serve as ballast for a dirigible, and pulled my paper from its slot, fifth down in the first row, right below the empty slot labeled Durkin. In the 3 years since I had returned to Funderbrack Center, I'd seen Mr. Durkin exactly twice. I left my dime on the counter since Louis was nowhere to be seen. Although the Post-Courier was only 7 cents, I kept giving Louis the other 3 as a fee for saving back issues for me when I was away from Funderbrack Center. The left front page story above the fold was a rehash, more on the continuing political fight between landing rights at the Aston Aerodrome between turbos and dirigibles. I sighed, despite myself. Some things didn't seem to change. I folded the paper into my case and climbed back into the Stanley for the short drive to the upper faculty car park. Not the lower one where I had dropped Lisette, but the larger one closer to my office. The old Dutch Republican house had been converted to the offices of the Natural Resources Department. Rather, I corrected myself, the expanded and renamed Department of Political and Natural Resource Sciences, dear David's political coup and brainchild. As I eased the steamer up Highland Street, the clock on the post center struck 9. 3 spaces remained, all in the back row. But what was I to expect when the car park only contained 4 dozen places, and nearly twice that number of faculty lived outside of walking distance? The latecomers parked where they could, but not, of course, around the square. Dean Erechus and the town elders had squabbled about that before the magistrates on at least 2 occasions, and that might recur. The dean's memoranda on the issue threatened to revoke faculty parking privileges for any faculty members so desperate as to occupy a space designed for those shopping at the establishments around the square. I vented the Stanley before locking it and walking to my office. Hilda, the department secretary, glanced up, her frizzy black hair pulled back into a bun.
Marriage continues to agree with you, Dr. Eschbach. You aren't haunting our halls every waking moment.
Her eyes flicked to David's closed and dark door. Hilda never was warm or polite when David was around, but in her position I probably wouldn't have been either. I continued to be very fortunate. That was true, in more ways than one. And what else could I say? A single message graced my box from the esteemed chairman, the most honorable Dr. David Doniger, a reminder of next Monday's faculty meeting on the special memo paper he used as chairman. Once in my office, I read through the Aston Post-Courier from front to back. 2 stories intrigued me particularly. The first was about the reaction of Quebec's president to a fishing rights issue. Montreal, WNS. President Alphonse Duval announced an agreement in principle with New France over the allocation of catches from the Grand Banks fisheries in return for approval of the sale of 3 new French Santa Ana-class frigates to the Navy of Quebec. The frigates are currently under construction at the San Diego Baja shipyards. Jacques Chirac, leader of the opposition Democratic Republicans, denounced the proposed agreement as an abrogation of Quebecois sovereignty over the Grand Banks and an invitation to a Colombian invasion. Colombian Defense Minister Holmbeck refused direct comment, but Defense Ministry sources indicated that the idea of military action to deal with fisheries matters was absurd. The Alliance for World Peace asked Speaker Hartpence to begin an investigation into the charges that the frigate sale agreement was leaked to the media in order to obtain support for an increase in the Colombian military budget for the coming fiscal year. For some reason the article bothered me, but I couldn't say why. I read the WNS story again, but still couldn't identify why it bothered me. The second story bothered me too, but for a different reason. Aston, RPI. The latest development in the Israel Ishmael murder case is a ghost. The ghost of the child Ishmael allegedly mutilated and murdered. Aston City Prosecutor Friedrich Devil yesterday used testimony from Dr. Fitzgerald Warren as key support for his argument that Ishmael had tortured his 6-year-old stepson for an extended period of time. In simple terms, said Devil, young children raised in a normal and loving atmosphere do not develop an awareness of death until they are much older, usually between 8 and 12. The fact that this boy barely 6 years old became a ghost is the strongest possible evidence that he had been repeatedly beaten, that he was aware of the possibility of death. Not only was he killed, but he was robbed of his childhood long before his death. Those close to defense attorney Edward Quiddick have suggested that Devol's argument is psychological poppycock with no basis in fact, and predict that Quiddick will address the issue with a battery of poltergeistic experts. The prosecuting attorney's argument made sense to me. Ghosts came from violent, knowledgeable death. My son Valtar had lived for nearly 10 minutes on that bloody Federal District Street, bleeding from bullets meant for me, and he'd been nearly 11, and he'd never become a ghost. Elspeth had died instantly, too quickly to become a ghost, and then I wished I had too. I'd had to learn to live again, and every day Lisette and Carolyn taught me a little more. At the knock on my half-open door, I set down the paper. "Come in." "Johan." Wilhelm Mondrian still remained the junior member of the expanded department. The shirt-tail relative of the painter continued to inform all who conversed at length with him, in some fashion or another, that he had received his doctorate from the University, Virginia. He had trouble understanding that I had ceased to worship unquestioningly at that or any other altar of higher education, Thomas Jefferson notwithstanding. "Yes?" "You know that David is going to bring up the question of putting a zero cap on registrations on Natural Resources 3B? Mondrian eased into my not terribly capacious office. Natural Resources 3B was officially the Ecology of Wetlands course that all the students hated, because none of them wanted a detailed environmental rationale for preserving wetlands when most of them had a tradition of either developing, filling, or reclaiming wetlands. The question of what course to cut back on always came back to wetlands ecology. I just sighed. Are we back to that again? I do not believe we ever left it. Renier Grimaldi stood in the door, chipper as always, in another of his European-cut suits, this one a dark grey chalk stripe, accented by a maroon cravat. Our Dr. David has the persistence of Ferdinand. Young Grimaldi had little love for Ferdinand, and I suppose I wouldn't have either, not if my father had died under the Panzerwagens when Ferdinand had contemptuously disregarded the older Grimaldi's surrender of Monaco. I take it our honoured chair is elsewhere this morning. He is having another tooth faultlessly capped, added Grimaldi, but he will return, both to us and the elimination of 3B. Unlike Gessler to Singapore, Mondrian attempted to cultivate a rumbling bass, but a mild baritone was all he could manage. How could Gessler have returned to Singapore after Chung Kuo had thrown 3 million crack troops into the peninsula? The Aussies hadn't let Columbia use Subic Bay as a staging area against the Chinese assault, not with both Japan and Chung Kuo exerting pressure. Of course, how long Australia itself, let alone its Philippine protectorate, would last was another question these days. Mondrian looked at Grimaldi. What is the festive occasion? Festive? This is conservative for me, Wilhelm. Grimaldi laughed. Johann, will you say anything about the wetlands course? Me? The chairman's favorite bête noire? They both waited. I'll make my usual point that wetlands are the pivot point of any integrated ecology, and I suppose that will get a grudging acceptance that one section will be taught in the spring and you two can fight over it. They both nodded. I need to finish preparing my 10 o'clock. Grimaldi vanished from the doorway. You are the only one Dr. Doniger must listen to, Mondrian said before he left, like the founders had to heed Jefferson. You do know that, do you not? I didn't know anything of the sort, only that David and I always clashed and probably always would, and that he had the dean on his side. I wasn't sure who or what was on my side except 2 assimilated ghosts and Lisette. Having Carolyn as part of my soul hadn't been too bad, but the ghost of justice I had created with my equipment was sometimes pretty hard for someone trying to deal with departmental politics. That had little reason and less justice. In fact, the whole ghosting and deghosting business was as confusing as departmental politics. Supposedly Heisler, the Austro-Hungarian scientist, had developed a system for systematically removing part of the electronic ego field that comprised the human spirit. Of course, that was the part of the spirit that became a ghost under the condition of knowledgeable violent death. Then, under contract to the Spazi, Brenston Hay, the late Babbage researcher at Funderbrack State, had developed a similar deghosting technology that could either remove the entire spirit from a live person, rendering him a zombie, or destroy any disembodied spirit that had become a ghost. A technology that could turn a healthy individual into a zombie wasn't something I'd wanted.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?